Good afternoon, guys. Now, today I wanted to talk about events that are taking place in South Africa and on the African continent for us as black people to understand the trouble that we're in at this particular time. We've seen xenophobia attacks. I've always said that there is no xenophobia, but we have got black people fighting for peanuts in a country where white people are carving the goose or the golden goose of the South African economy. I still maintain that what we have in South Africa is not xenophobia, but what it is poor people fighting for resources because the majority of the economy and wealth is held by white people. But as Africans, we've got to understand that for us to be able to get out of the situation that we are in, we have to first of all, number one, be informed in this information era. Number two, we've got to make a decision very quickly to unite, come together, and be able to fight for the self-determination of nations and the unity of Africa if we are going to beat the Europeans at the game that they're playing. You see, the problem, my African brothers, is that while you are still trying to decide whether to come together, the Europeans decided 130 years ago that they were going to unite and they were going to exploit you in order to survive. They decided that Africa has got all the resources that they need, and they need to process these resources, they need to control these resources, they need to take these resources as processed goods to market for them to maintain their standard of living. And this has never changed. And in that equation, the African is supposed to be a slave and nothing else. And to ensure that this was going to happen, they divided Africa into 54 small little countries that would never be able to self-determine. More importantly, they made sure that those 54 small little states will be divided according to tribe, and they'll always be destabilized by tribal conflict. Now, I've heard a lot of South Africans say that Africans must go home. They must go home because South Africa needs to self-determine, it needs to take advantage of its own resources, and that can only happen when Africans are gone. It's a very misguided perspective because Africans in this country control less than 2% of the wealth of this nation. They do not own land, they do not own mines, they do not own resources, do not own banks, they do not own the companies that control this economy, and they don't own a single company on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, which is where most of the looting of this country takes place. And once we understand that, we also need to understand that all the African countries that a lot of South Africans are saying are failing and Africans must go back and fix those countries were made to fail by a design that started at the Berlin Conference and was continued before South Africa got independence. Now I'm going to tell you a story about a period that was called the Total Strategy that was implemented by the apartheid government starting from 1984. The Total Strategy was about destabilizing the SADC region, ensuring that SADC countries would be destabilized, would not be able to come together in unity, their economies would be penalized and would be made to depend on the South African apartheid government economy. Not only would they depend on the South African government, not only would they depend on the South African economy, they would also end up depending on white corporations once South Africa got independence and the ANC was in charge. This period from 1984 all the way to 1992, when negotiations were now underway for the independence of South Africa, was a period of destabilization of all SADC countries. It is said that that destabilization, which started in Angola, went through to Namibia, went through to sponsoring rebels in Mozambique and destabilizing Zimbabwe. With all the what you call the tribal conflicts that you saw in Zimbabwe, it was part of this total strategy. I always say that those were some of the first sanctions that Zimbabwe went through, and sanctions that the entire SADC region went through that cost the SADC region in excess of $70 billion. In today's money, it will be well over $100 billion that these countries lost. That is part and parcel of why those countries are underdeveloped. That underdevelopment is part of the reason why you see this dependency on the South African economy, which was designed by the apartheid government when this total strategy was implemented. That total strategy made sure that these African countries that had just gotten independence would never be able to stand up because they were kept in wars. They were destabilized by bombs. They were destabilized by rebels being sponsored by the apartheid government so that they would spend money on war. A country like Zimbabwe saw its Beira pipeline, a pipeline for fuel that comes from Beira into Zimbabwe, bombed. It saw Beira port itself bombed, sabotaged by South African mercenaries and South African companies to ensure that all the fuel that Zimbabwe would rely on for at least a 5-year period of time during destabilization was coming from South Africa. Also destroying the Zimbabwean companies that will be reliant on that fuel. This is what the total strategy was about. It made sure that all the countries in SADC were indebted. They were owing the IMF. They had to sponsor armies. They had to keep their nations safe by taking loans from the IMF. And remember that no African country got reparations for colonialism. No African country was ever emancipated or compensated for the pillage that happened. And then after South Africa got independence, you must also understand that the South African government of the ANC allowed monies that were being stolen, monies that were being pillaged by ex-colonizers, by the British, by the Italians, by the Chinese, by the Boers, to be leaked out of these countries and brought into South African banks. This is part and parcel of the externalization that destroyed a lot of countries, particularly Zimbabwe. White farmers were able to move money that they made by pillaging Zimbabwe, by raping, pillaging, stealing land, and exploiting our parents. That money was allowed to come into South Africa with ease. The Reserve Bank of South Africa, which is a white-controlled private institution, allowed those monies to come here. That was part and parcel of the reason why we saw externalization and the destruction of value, the destruction of savings in countries like Zimbabwe. Soon after that, with the debt that had been incurred from the total destabilization, with this, the externalization of money, once we started taking land and that money coming into an economy like South Africa, it also went after the most experienced, educated, and moneyed class of Zimbabwe. That brain drain that was again induced by South African corporations that were following the total destabilization made sure that Zimbabwe was lacking the skills to be able to pick it up the moment it took land. Now, when a country takes the rich of a country, when it takes the educated of a country to leave the uneducated in the country, what does it expect to happen to that country? Eventually, the poor will follow where the money went to. Eventually, the educated will follow where all the externalized monies went to, because that money was the wealth, those were the savings that Zimbabwe was supposed to use to pick itself up. That money was made off the exploitation of our resources, the exploitation of our land, the exploitation of our labor. And once it was stolen and pilfered into the banking system of South Africa through the Reserve Bank, through white corporations that were implementing the total strategy, Zimbabweans were left with no option but to be refugees in the very same country that had taken that wealth, that accepted that wealth, that had taken the rich people of our country and taken the criminals who had stolen from the Zimbabwean economy. This can be replicated in Zambia, Mozambique, Angola, Namibia, Botswana. South Africa destabilized all those countries during apartheid, and the ANC government was complicit in continuing the creation of a monopoly in South Africa at the expense of its neighbors. This is part and parcel of the reason why you see refugees coming into South Africa because of that. Now with Zimbabwe, this country that had begun to make sure that our region was safe from imperialism, safe from destabilization by Boer armies that were being created in the region, they went and they liberated Mozambique. From liberating Mozambique, there was destabilization in Congo that was also being financed by the apartheid government. And when Mandela took over, there were mercenaries that were coming from the ex-militaries of South Africa, destabilizing Congo to ensure that Congo would not have good leadership. Mugabe sent his troops into these two countries to bring stability. And in Congo, he stopped Kabila from being overthrown, forced a negotiation in South Africa that was called the Sun City Accord. For that, Robert Mugabe was punished by the Americans and the Europeans who were sponsoring the rebels, together with apartheid South African forces and mercenaries, to ensure that there was no stability in Congo for their companies to continue to loot. Zimbabwe was punished. It was sanctioned for that. It was sanctioned for being in Congo, for stabilizing Congo. It was punished for stabilizing Mozambique and stabilizing the SADC region. over and above taking its land. And because we had colonial institutions like the SADC Tribunal, that SADC Tribunal made a ruling that white land must be given back to white farmers. That is problematic. This is what we're fighting. This is the underdevelopment that is pushing Zimbabweans into countries like South Africa. And South Africans say that Africans must go and fix their own country. Africans want to go and fix their own country, but there's a lot of distraction that has taken place in these countries because of the ex-apartheid government and a complicit ANC government that continues to allow a monopoly to be created in South Africa for the benefit of South Africans and at the detriment of other African countries. This is something that needs to be fixed by an ANC government that sits together with other African governments and SADC governments to ensure that there's going to be equitability. But because South Africa continues to be a white monopoly, the white monopoly wants to control 80% of the resources of this country in the same way that they already control those resources in this country. We need to be able to deal with that. So that's why the xenophobia that we're seeing, the fighting of Africans by Africans because of deprivation by white people has got to end. And this is something we've got to address by national unity and African unity, and that is what we are standing for. Zimbabweans United Against Sanctions is not about fighting sanctions in Zimbabwe, but it is a metaphor of fighting imperialism, racism, and all these inhumanities that are happening where white people continue to control our economies and continue to persecute people. We must not fight each other. We know who the enemy is. We know who is violating human rights in this continent. That is what we need to address in unity. Lizwe lethu.